The rain had finally died just before dawn, leaving Busan under a heavy, suffocating mist. Outside the shattered glass entrance of the wedding hall, the air still smelled of burnt sugar and scorched silk, the bitter aftertaste of a celebration turned to ash. Deep red roses, meant to symbolize an eternal beginning, floated aimlessly in puddles of muddy water. From the fractured iron doors, remnants of ceremonial drapes swayed like ghosts in the wind, accompanied only by the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens echoing through the deserted coastal streets. At the absolute center of the wreckage sat Ananya Rao. She did not wear the traditional white of the country she had lived in since her teenage years. Instead, she was draped in a heavy traditional Indian bridal sari of deep, bruised maroon. The intricate gold embroidery was frayed, soaked in rainwater and stained with a dark, terrifying crimson that did not belong to the fabric. Ananya was the daughter of an Indian textile tycoon who had moved his empire to Busan decades ago. Hours ago, she had been a bride, her skin scented with jasmine and sandalwood. Minutes later, she had become a widow. Her mind offered her nothing but fragmented, violent flashes. Her husband, Rohan, laughing as he loosened his collar, the blinding glare of high beams reflecting off the slick, wet asphalt, the sickening screech of tires, the crushing sound of metal folding like paper, then an abyss. The doctors at the university hospital spoke in hushed, clinical tones about trauma-induced memory fracture. She possessed the vivid, agonizing memory of the vows she had taken, but the violent crescendo that followed was entirely erased. Miles away, in a dimly lit, damp apartment overlooking the docks, a laptop screen illuminated the dark. On it, a stolen live feed of Anya's hospital room played in a loop. She looked small beneath the sterile sheets, her dark skin pale, her large eyes staring fixedly at the ceiling. A man sat in the dark, leaning close enough to the monitor to see the tremor in her hands. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. "Perfect," Min-jun whispered, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. Min-jun operated under a trinity of absolute rules. A never steal from those who have nothing. A never trust those who have everything. And never, under any circumstance, allow a woman to get beneath your skin. At 28, Min-jun was a study in sharp angles and quiet menace. He possessed the kind of striking, effortless handsomeness that disarmed people. A low, raspy voice and a slow, devastating smile that made targets overlook their missing watch until he was 3 blocks away. His partner in both crime and bed was Kim Soo-jin. Their relationship was built on a foundation of adrenaline, shared cigarettes, and a fierce, possessive codependency. Soo-jin loved him with the frantic, clawing obsession of a woman who had staked her entire existence on one man. She hated sharing his attention even when it was for a job. But when she unearthed the details of Ananya Rao's inheritance, millions of dollars caught in a legal deadlock between Korea and India following her husband's sudden demise, the greed was too potent to ignore. "She's a ghost walking," Soo-jin murmured one evening, leaning against the railing by the Han River, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. She took a long drag of her cigarette, the cherry glowing bright in the dusk. "A grieving, isolated widow. She has no family left in this country, Min-jun. She's bleeding dry, and she's ripe for the picking." Min-jun didn't answer immediately. His gaze was anchored to the printed photograph of Ananya in his hand. Her dark eyes weren't just empty. They looked haunted, carrying a quiet, simmering resilience that unsettled something deep in his chest. "She doesn't look weak," Min-jun noted, his thumb brushing over the grain of the photo, tracing the curve of her jawline. Soo-jin scoffed, stepping closer to him, her hand sliding inside his leather jacket to rest against his chest. "Grief makes everyone weak. Look at me. What's the play?" Min-jun looked down at Soo-jin, then back at the photograph. The money was life-altering. "You find her routine," he said softly, his voice dropping an octave. I become the only thing keeping her afloat. 3 weeks passed before Min-jun made his move. He tracked her to a secluded, ancient temple nestled in the dense, forested hills just outside Busan. Ananya had stripped herself of all bridal opulence. She wore a simple loose-fitting cotton salwar kameez devoid of jewelry, her long dark hair woven into a loose braid. The city's high society was alive with venomous whispers about her. The cursed bride, the one-night widow. She stood beneath a canopy of swaying paper lanterns, her fingers lightly tracing the rough wood of a prayer wheel. When the sky opened up, a shadow fell over her, shielding her from the sudden downpour. You'll catch a cold standing out here. A smooth baritone voice murmured in flawless Korean. Ananya flinched slightly, stepping back. She looked up into a pair of dark, intensely warm eyes. The stranger was tall, dressed in a sleek black overcoat, holding a wide umbrella over her head while letting his own shoulder get soaked by the rain. I'm fine, she replied, her voice rusty from weeks of disuse. You aren't, Min-jun said softly. His gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that felt entirely too intimate for a stranger. He didn't offer a charming thief's smile. He offered a steady, grounded presence. Let me walk you to your car. The hustle began with a slow, agonizingly deliberate burn. Min-jun did not rush her. He played the part of a patient, unassuming guardian angel. He became the man who anticipated her needs before she even realized them, driving her through the choked streets of Busan when the weather turned, standing like a wall between her and the predatory reporters, and brewing hot tea for her in the dead of night when her screams from nightmares woke the neighbors. Weeks bled into each other, and the boundary between the con and reality began to blur. One night, inside his and Soo-jin's cramped apartment, the tension snapped. You haven't even touched her yet, Soo-jin hissed, cornering him against the kitchen counter, her fingers digging into his hips. It's been a month, Min-jun. You're supposed to have her in your bed, signing over the power of attorney. Min-jun caught Soo-jin's wrists, his grip firm, his expression unreadable. She trusts me. You can't rush a woman who has lost everything. She'll bolt. Are you sure that's what it is? Soo-jin whispered, her eyes flashing with jealousy as she leaned up to bite his lower lip. Or are you enjoying playing the savior? Min-jun kissed her back, hard and devoid of affection, trying to drown out the memory of Anya's soft, melodic voice. But as he closed his eyes, all he could see was the way Anya's fingers trembled when she was anxious, and the intoxicating, foreign scent of jasmine that seemed to cling to his jacket long after he left her side. It was impossible to hide the shift from a woman who knew him inside out. Soo-jin noticed the subtle infractions first. Min-jun no longer referred to Ananya as the mark. When he spoke of her, his voice lost its clinical, detached edge. He began remembering the smallest, most insignificant details about her. The way her breath hitched whenever thunder cracked, the defensive manner in which her hand flew to the hollow of her throat when she felt cornered, and the way she would unconsciously lapse into a soft blend of Hindi and Korean when she was overwhelmed with emotion. One midnight, Soo-jin woke to find his side of the bed cold. She found him sitting by the window, the glow of his phone illuminating a rare, genuine smile on his face as he reread a mundane text message from Ananya thanking him for the groceries. That smile struck terror into Soo-jin's heart. You're falling for her, Soo-jin said, her voice shaking as she stood in the doorway. Min-jun didn't look up immediately. When he did, his face was a mask of cold indifference, but his knuckles were white against the phone. Don't be ridiculous. Have you slept with her? She demanded, walking over and snatching the phone from his grip. Tell me the truth, Min-jun. Have you crossed that line? No, he growled, standing up to his full height, towering over her. He hadn't. But God, he wanted to. Every time he was near Ananya, the urge to reach out and pull her into his chest was becoming a physical ache. Ananya carried her loneliness like a dangerous, smoldering fire hidden beneath layers of heavy silk. She was fragile, yet burning, and Min-jun was a damaged man hopelessly drawn to the heat. The monsoon season hit Busan with a feral intensity. At 2 a.m. Min-jun's phone buzzed. There was no text, just the sound of ragged, hyperventilating breaths on the other end of the line. When he arrived at her sprawling, lonely estate, he found the front door wide open. Ananya was standing on the veranda, barefoot, her clothes drenched through, clinging to the curves of her body. She was shivering violently, her skin glistening under the moonlight. "Ananya!" he breathed, rushing up the steps and grabbing her by the upper arms. Her skin was ice cold, but her eyes were wild, blazing with a terrifying fever. "I saw the glass again, Min-jun," she whispered, her teeth chattering as she clutched at the lapels of his coat. The smell of the fire, it was everywhere. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring her faint protests, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. Almost on cue, a massive crack of thunder shook the foundations of the house, and the city's power grid failed. The entire mansion was plunged into pitch blackness, save for a single half-burned candle melting on the console table. Min-jun sat her down on the heavy velvet sofa, immediately wrapping a thick, dry wool blanket around her shoulders. He knelt on the floor before her, his hands chafing her freezing paws. Then, without warning, the wall she had built around herself completely disintegrated. She didn't sob loudly. It was a silent, devastating collapse. Large, heavy tears spilled over her lashes, tracking down her dark cheeks, her lips parting as she gasped for air. "I don't even remember his last words to me," Ananya choked out, her gaze dropping to Min-jun's hands holding hers. "We were laughing in the car and then nothing. What kind of monstrous wife forgets the last words her husband spoke to her?" Min-jun looked up at her. In the flickering golden candlelight, her sorrow was the most beautiful, devastating thing he had ever witnessed. The guilt of his deception began to claw at his throat, suffocating him. "You aren't a monster," he said, his voice dropping into a thick, ragged whisper. He stood up, shifting his weight onto the sofa beside her. "You survived, Ananya. That is not a crime. Sometimes it feels like one," she whispered, looking up at him. Their faces were inches apart. The air between them grew thick, charged with weeks of unspoken hunger and repressed tension. Min-jun's gaze dropped to her wet, trembling lips. Every rule he had ever lived by screamed at him to pull away, but he was entirely powerless. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a hand, his rough thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. His touch was so reverent, so incredibly tender, that Ananya let out a soft, fractured sigh. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned into his palm, her large eyes searching his face for an anchor. "Min-jun!" She breathed his name like a prayer. The last thread of his control snapped. Min-jun leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hot against her skin. "I shouldn't," he muttered against her lips, a confession of his own damnation. "God help me, I shouldn't. Please," she whispered. "Just make me feel alive again." Ananya closed the distance, her lips pressing against his. It began as a soft, hesitant touch, broken and desperate for comfort. But as Min-jun's arms locked around her waist, pulling her flesh against his chest, the kiss ignited into something fierce, possessive, and deeply consuming. He deepened the kiss with a ravenous intensity, his tongue tangling with hers as he drank in her sighs. He poured all of his self-loathing, his guilt, and his terrifying illicit love into the touch. Anya's hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him as the storm raged outside. That night, on the dark sofa amidst the scent of rain and melting wax, the hustle ceased to exist. There was only the blistering heat of two fractured souls tearing each other apart to find a moment of peace. The strike came out of nowhere, cracking across Min-jun's face with enough force to split his lower lip. He didn't flinch. He merely turned his head back, tasting the metallic tang of blood, and looked at Soo-jin. She was trembling, her eyes bloodshot, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You slept with her," she breathed, her voice a ragged pitch. "Don't lie to me, Min-jun. I smelled the jasmine on you when you walked through that door. You stayed the whole night." Min-jun remained silent, standing by the cracked mirror of their bedroom. His silence was the ultimate executioner. "She's a mark," Soo-jin screamed, throwing a glass vase against the wall, sending shards flying across the floor. "She's a stupid, naive Indian girl with a dead husband and a fat bank account. We were supposed to ruin her." "She isn't stupid," Min-jun said, his voice dangerously low, a quiet edge entering his tone that made Soo-jin freeze. "Oh, so now you defend her? The great Lee Min-jun has a heart now." She laughed bitterly, tears finally spilling over her heavy makeup. "She trusts a lie. She loves a ghost." "I know what I am," Min-jun muttered, turning away from her. But he didn't. For the first time in his 28 years, he had no idea who he was when he wasn't with Ananya. That night, Soo-jin systematically tore their apartment to pieces, smashing mirrors, ripping photographs of them together, her grief turning into a lethal, toxic malice. Before she stormed out into the night, she stopped at the threshold, looking back at him with a smile that chilled him to the bone. "What do you think will happen when her pretty little head clears, Min-jun?" she whispered. "What if she remembers the accident?" Min-jun's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat, because there was one absolute terrifying truth that Ananya's fractured mind had blocked out. The crash that killed Ananya Rao had not been an act of God. It had been an ambush. The mind is an unpredictable maze. For Ananya, the walls began to crumble in the quiet hours of the morning. It started with a nightmare that didn't end when she opened her eyes. Fragments of the missing minutes began to piece themselves together like shards of broken glass piercing through her consciousness. A black SUV tailing their bridal car. The blinding flash of high beams wasn't an oncoming vehicle. It was a deliberate ramming from the side. She remembered Rohan shouting, wrestling with the steering wheel. And she remembered a man standing by the side of the rain-slicked road just before the crash, holding a camera, his sharp, predatory eyes capturing the entire sequence. A man with a familiar, dangerous smile. Ananya woke up gasping for air, her sheets soaked in sweat. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her husband had been targeted. A thief, a hustler had been tracking them. Over the next week, Ananya played the most dangerous game of her life. She maintained her fragile, deeply passionate relationship with Min-jun. She let him hold her, let his hands map the contours of her body, let his lips leave burning trails along her throat, all while secretly using her father's lingering corporate connections to dig into the background of the man in her bed. The deeper she dug, the more the hideous truth unveiled itself. Lee Min-jun was a ghost in the system, a master of fraud. Yet, the cruelest irony of all was that the closer she came to the ugly truth of his identity, the more she realized how desperately, irrevocably she had fallen in love with him. Every touch of his had felt real. Every time he held her after a nightmare, his heart had beat with a frantic, protective rhythm against her ear. The duality of it was a slow poison. The man who had likely engineered her destruction was the only man who made her want to live. The confrontation did not happen in the shadows. It happened in the grand echoing foyer of Ananya's estate. Driven insane by jealousy and the realization that Min-jun was completely lost to her, Soo-jin bypassed the security and confronted Ananya directly. "You think you're special?" Soo-jin hissed, standing across from Ananya, a wicked, jagged smile on her face. "You think he looks at your dark skin and sees a queen? You were a paycheck, Ananya. A scam to bail us out of the docks. Ananya stood perfectly still, her face draining of all color. Though she had suspected, hearing it aloud felt like a blade twisting in her abdomen. Every beautiful, tender memory they had shared over the past months, the quiet drives, the desperate, feverish lovemaking in the dark, the warmth of his skin against hers, felt instantly contaminated. All of it, Ananya whispered, her voice trembling. A script. Every single second, Soo-jin sneered. The heavy oak doors of the mansion burst open, and Min-jun charged in, his chest heaving, his face pale with a raw, unadulterated terror he had never felt in his life. The moment his eyes landed on Anya's shattered, tear-stained face, something inside him completely broke. Ananya! He stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender, his voice fracturing. Listen to me. Ananya looked at him, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden lethal fire. Did you kill my husband, Min-jun? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Min-jun froze. The silence that followed was the most agonizing, definitive answer possible. I am a thief, Min-jun confessed, his voice dropping into a rough, guttural register as he took a step closer, his eyes pleading with hers. I am a liar. I forged the documents to get to your inheritance. Everything she said about the setup is true. Ananya let out a broken, choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. But I did not kill Rohan, he said desperately, his chest heaving as tears finally blurred his own vision. The crash. It wasn't supposed to happen. We were hired to steal a ledger of corporate accounts from his car that night. We were told it was a simple asset theft. Someone else altered the plan. Someone wanted him dead. Who? Ananya demanded, her voice cutting through the space. Before he could utter a name, the heavy glass windows of the foyer shattered inward. A sharp, deafening gunshot exploded through the room. From the shadows of the veranda stepped Park Jin-woo, Rohan's trusted older business partner, the man who had sat at their wedding feast hours before the tragedy. He held a silenced pistol, his face devoid of remorse. He was the real mastermind, the one who needed Rohan eliminated to seize total control of the textile conglomerate. You should have stayed oblivious, Mrs. Rao, Park Jin-woo said coldly, raising the weapon. Chaos erupted in a flash of heat and blood. Jin-woo fired again. Min-jun lunged forward to shield Ananya. But it was Soo-jin who threw herself into the line of fire, her old hardwired instinct to protect Min-jun taking over before her brain could process the betrayal. The bullet tore through Soo-jin's chest. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, a bright burst of crimson pooling rapidly around her. Min-jun let out a primal, animalistic roar, tackling Jin-woo to the ground. The two men wrestled fiercely in the dark, a brutal, desperate scramble for survival until a final echoing shot rang out. Jin-woo went limp, the gun slipping from his fingers as Min-jun stood over him, panting, his hands covered in blood. Min-jun dropped to his knees beside Soo-jin, his hands trembling violently as he pressed down on her wound. Ananya knelt on the other side, her bridal instincts returning as she tried to staunch the bleeding with her bare hands. Soo-jin looked up, her breathing shallow, rattling in her chest. She looked at Min-jun, then turned her fading gaze toward Ananya. A weak, bitter, yet strangely peaceful smile touched her lips. I hated you, Soo-jin whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth as she reached out, her fingers weakly brushing Anya's dark wrist. I hated you so much. But he didn't play you at the end. He really loved you. Her eyes went glassy, her hand falling limp against the marble. The bitter winter of Busan arrived with a quiet, biting chill. Lee Min-jun did not run. He surrendered to the authorities, confessing to corporate espionage, fraud, and grand theft. He served his time in a federal penitentiary on the outskirts of the city. He did not ask for a lawyer. He accepted his penance. Ananya did not leave Korea. She took over her father's textile empire, her name clearing as the truth of Park Jin-woo's conspiracy came to light. And once every month, she drove down to the gray, sterile walls of the prison. Their meetings across the thick glass partition were devoid of grand declarations. They didn't speak of the past, nor did they make promises for the future. Love that had survived a baptism of betrayal, death, and fire was no longer loud or demanding. It had become something quieter, heavier, and infinitely more real. 14 months later, on the day of his release, the snow was falling heavily over Busan, dusting the black iron gates of the facility in white. Min-jun walked out through the small side door, dressed in a simple denim jacket, his collar turned up against the biting wind. He stopped when he saw her. Ananya was standing beside her car, wrapped in a long dark wool coat. Her hair was loose, catching the falling flakes of snow. There were no dramatic speeches, no tears. Forgiveness was a long, arduous road they hadn't fully crossed yet. But as she stepped toward him, the space between them seemed to vanish. She reached up, her warm, dark hands gentle as she wound a thick, maroon silk scarf around his neck, her fingers lingering against the skin of his throat. "You still lie too much, Lee Min-jun," she murmured, her voice a soft, breathless caress in the freezing air. Min-jun looked down at her, his eyes dark with an intensity that burned hotter than any fire they had survived. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips as he reached up, his large hand covering hers against his neck. "And you still trust entirely too easily, Ananya Rao," he replied, his voice rough. For the first time since the night of the wedding fire, Ananya smiled back. A small, fragile yet breathtaking thing. Between the ashes of their past, the guilt of their choices, and a love that had ruined them both, they turned their backs on the dark and walked into the cold together. Subscribe for more cinematic novels tales unsaid and comment, what was your favorite part?